Good evening and welcome to Tracking the Tropics, your weekly in-depth look at the hurricane season and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is week 5 of the Atlantic hurricane season already and the end of our first month of the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. And here's what we have coming up tonight on episode 5 of Tracking the Tropics.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Van Denton. I'm the Chief Meteorologist at Fox 8 WGHP in Greensboro, High Point, Winston-Salem, known as the Piedmont Triad of North Carolina. Here in North Carolina, we have quite a hurricane history. And tonight, we're going to be looking back at that history, going all the way back to the 1500s. And we're also focusing on the decade of the 1950s, when North Carolina got the nickname Hurricane Alley.
All right, Van, also, despite history suggesting major June storms are rare, it does happen. And in just a few minutes, we're going to go visit with meteorologist Maria Sotolongo in Houston, Texas. Almost 20 years ago, they had a June storm that didn't even make hurricane status devastate southeast Texas. She's going to walk us through the history of that storm and show us what Tropical Storm Allison did to the Lone Star State. But first, let's update you on what's currently going on in the tropics. Today is the last day of June, as you know, and we just continued a streak that has now lasted 34 years. The continental United States did not have any hurricanes make landfall this month. The last continental United hurricane landfall was June with Bonnie back in 1986. That hit Texas, so it's now been 34 years and counting since the U.S. has had a hurricane hit in June. 19 hurricanes overall have made landfall in June in the continental United States, and that goes all the way back to 1851. So let's keep that streak going, and let's take a look at what's happening right now out in the tropics. First of all, this time of year, we typically see things form in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Western Caribbean, or somewhere around the Bahamas. So we look there now, and it is hard to find any clouds, and I know what we're all going through right now. This would be a great time to visit the Caribbean. This would be a great time to be on a cruise out there. I know that's not really possible right now, but really some tranquil weather across the Gulf of Mexico, across the Caribbean, and in and around the Bahamas. So nothing looks to be forming there. So we go a little farther out, which as we transition to July, the activity forms not so much close to us, but a little farther out, and that'll continue as we go into August and September. So we look out there, though, and sure, you see some typical thunderstorm activity around the intertropical convergence zone, you know, just around there closer to the equator. Still nothing happening out there. And even off the coast of Africa, you know, later in the summer, that's where we'll see storms form and they'll come all the way across the Atlantic. We just don't see anything right now. But let me tell you, that water is warm. So while things may not be perfect in the upper atmosphere, down in the water they are. Remember, you got to have 80-degree water. That's like the first ingredient you need to get a tropical system to form. And we've got it. So everywhere you see red here in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean, we have temperatures around the Bahamas well into the 80s. And these water temperatures, the sea surface temperatures and the anomalies, when we compare them to years past, they are above average and they are right in line with what we would typically see during an active hurricane season. So if we look at all the active hurricane seasons over the years, and we compare those active seasons to the water temperatures, our water temperatures now are very similar to all those active years. So that's just more proof that we are on our way to an active tropical season. Unless we don't get rid of the Saharan dust. Remember, that's been a big story over the past week and a half all over the United States, because the Saharan dust made it up to the United States, giving us some haze, some amazing sunsets. So as we check in on the Saharan dust forecast, picking it up from its current state, and again, you can see there's a little bit of an enhanced plume that has come off the coast of Africa. Otherwise, everything kind of back toward the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Caribbean, not as intense as what we saw last week. But let's just go ahead and play this out over the next 7 days. You see, there's not going to be a lot of penetration of the dust into the lower 48. But there's still going to be a little bit coming across the Atlantic. And remember, Saharan dust, while it's not something you can, see and it's going to fall on you if you're underneath it, but it stays up in the upper atmosphere about 1 to 2 miles up, and it prohibits thunderstorms from forming. It's a dry dust. And you need moisture to form thunderstorms. You need thunderstorms to form tropical systems. So this is going to continue on into next week, so we don't expect that we're going to see anything. But boy, that dust was a pretty amazing phenomenon. I don't know if you got to experience it where you are. Here's what it looked like from the satellite last week. And you can see, well, first look at the regular ocean over the Atlantic. Look how blue, deep blue that is with the white clouds. But then you come over here to the Gulf of Mexico right here and down into the Caribbean, and you see that haze. That's the Saharan dust. So it was very visible on satellite, and it provided us with amazing sunsets like this. This is from Beaufort, North Carolina. And sure, they typically have some pretty good sunsets, but rarely do they see something this amazing. And that's all the particles of dust in the upper atmosphere interacting as the sun is setting, creating some colors that we don't normally see. And it also was visible when we had a moonshot. This was from just a couple days ago over Raleigh, North Carolina. That is a 3/4 moon, and you can see it kind of has a little bit of a haze. That's some of the leftover dust. So let's kind of wrap up our talk here about hurricanes before we get to our first guest. And remember, we have made it through 4 named storms. Edouard would be our next named storm. The earliest 5th named storm we have ever had was Emily in 2005. That happened on July 12th. So we have 2 weeks to break a record, essentially, 12 days before Edouard forms. But as I showed you, nothing really is out there forming. This time of year, remember, we look at the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Caribbean, and the Bahamas. These are the typical June formation points from 1851 to 2019. Everywhere you see a dot, that's where a tropical storm or a hurricane formed. So as we head into July, these dots move a little farther to the east. And remember, we are still very early in the hurricane season. As we look at a graph of tropical activity over the years, it peaks in September. We're still way back here in the graph. That compares to activity that we would also normally see as we get into November. So June and November are very comparable when you look at named storm hurricane activity. In fact, as we kind of break it down, you can see June only has about 6% of the named storms throughout the entire season. Very similar to July, very similar to November. It's still not really until August, September, and October that things really start to pick up. All right, now on to our first guest tonight. The Carolinas have an extensive hurricane history, which earned our coast a catchy nickname. For more on that, let's welcome in Fox 8 WGHP Chief Meteorologist Van Denton in Greensboro, North Carolina to the show. Van, we've all heard of Tornado Alley in the Midwest, but maybe not Hurricane Alley. And for a time there years ago, you could make a pretty good case that Hurricane Alley was over the Carolinas and Mid-Atlantic. Tell us a little bit about that.
Indeed it was, Wes. What we had in the 1950s was really just a reflection of our past, but it was the most notable decade in our history, and you're going to learn about that in this package coming up. But you know, our history started when the first discoverers came to America in the 1500s. They had to deal with our hurricanes even back then. Take a look at this story. North Carolina has quite a storied and long hurricane history. Our earliest incomplete records date back to the 1500s. At the time, there were New World explorations, and many of the early settlements and their ships were caught up in the fate of these powerful storms. In one such case, then Governor White sailed to England to get more supplies for a new colony on Roanoke Island. He returned in 1590 and could not find the colonists. Homes had vanished. He did find the word Croatan carved in a nearby tree. Some have speculated the fate of this lost colony was due to a hurricane. Over the next few centuries, there were many hurricanes that caused damage to coastal settlements along our coast, and some reshaped our coastline. One of the most notable hurricanes was on September 6th of 1846. It was very intense and was a slow mover. The northeast winds pushed a remarkable storm surge across the Pamlico and Albemarle Sounds. This flooded rivers and creeks for miles inland. Then when the storm slowly moved north, the winds rotated back from southwest toward the northeast, pushing massive amounts of water back toward the ocean, overwashing the Outer Banks. On the night of September 7th, this massive amount of water created a new inlet that still stands today, Hatteras Inlet. Then the next day, a second inlet was created just south of Roanoke Island, Oregon Inlet, named for the first boat to pass through it, the Oregon. This storm was known for reshaping the Outer Banks of North Carolina. In the 1950s, North Carolina got a nickname that left an impression on me when I first heard it. We all know about Tornado Alley in the Plain States where so many tornadoes occur. We got the name Hurricane Alley for a decade. Between 1953 and 1955, we had 7 hurricanes impact the North Carolina coast, 3 in 1954 alone. Hurricanes Carol in late August, Edna in September were just warm-ups for the most powerful and destructive of all time, Hazel in October. I am standing where Hurricane Hazel made landfall on October 15, 1954. It was unlike any hurricane ever recorded in North Carolina history. As a matter of fact, to my left on the southeastern coast, it really hit them hard. There's one community, Long Beach, which is now part of Oak Island, that really took a hard hit. They had 357 structures on that island before the hurricane. After Hazel, only 5 were left standing. Hurricane Hazel was different in many ways. It was a rare threat in October, and it was a fast mover. It had been moving due west through the Caribbean when all of a sudden it made a sharp right turn and headed north. Due to the jet stream being stronger in October, this wind field helped pull the system north faster than a typical hurricane. It moved in so fast there was little time to prepare. To complicate matters, Chief of the Weather Bureau's office in Miami, Grady Norton, similar to what we call the director of the National Hurricane Center today, had a stroke on the morning of October 9th and died later the same day. Their office had to scramble to pick up coverage of the storm. Hazel was devastating for Haiti with winds over 125 miles per hour. Tides reached record levels there. But shortly after, the storm weakened to only 40 miles per hour after crossing the Haitian mountains. Once it neared the Bahamas, it rapidly got stronger and concerns grew again. Hurricane-force winds were reached in Myrtle Beach by 6 a.m. on October 15th and got stronger for the next few hours. Highest winds on the Grand Strand, 130 miles per hour at Cherry Grove with waves of 30 feet. Storm surge was 14 to 17 feet on the Grand Strand. The eye was large and it swept across land along the North Carolina-South Carolina border between 9:30 and 10 a.m. It produced the largest storm surge in history on the southern beaches of North Carolina, where it reached 18 feet at Calabash. Made even worse by the supermoon, which occurred at the same time. This supermoon makes tides unusually high even in non-storm situations. On top of the tides, the winds were the worst ever measured in North Carolina. 150-mile-per-hour winds at Holden Beach, Calabash, and Little River Inlet. 140 miles per hour at Oak Island with 125 at Wrightsville Beach. 98 miles per hour in the city of Wilmington. Because it was moving so fast, the strong winds made it well inland too. Moving at nearly 50 miles per hour, this storm produced gusts to 110 miles per hour in Fayetteville and even higher, 120 miles per hour in Goldsboro and Kinston. It even reached 90 miles per hour at RDU. Now here in the Triad, our maximum winds only reached 38. But we had more than a half foot of flooding rainfall. After making landfall at 10 a.m., the storm had already passed between Raleigh and Goldsboro by 1:30. It was already in Washington, D.C. by 5 p.m. with 98-mile-per-hour winds there. Ironically, eastern North Carolina did not get much rainfall, generally just 1 to 2 inches of rain from this fast-moving storm. The Piedmont, in this case, got the most rainfall, with over a half foot in many locations. Because the storm moved so fast, gusts reached near 100 miles per hour all the way to Delaware, New Jersey, and New York as it headed into Canada. Hazel was last seen crossing the Arctic Circle as it headed into Scandinavia. Its destruction stretched across 2,000 miles of coastal North America.
Hurricane Alley, unfortunately headlined by Hazel. Now, Van, I'm not going to ask you how old you are. Hazel back in 1954, but you have spent your whole life in the Carolinas, and you've heard so many stories about Hazel in the 50s, including from your parents.
That's right. Well, my parents grew up in the Rocky Mount area, and they didn't know each other at the time, but they both experienced that devastating hurricane, and it was certainly devastating for many folks that were dealing with it. The wind speeds were something they had never seen that far inland because it moves so quickly. Wes, you know how when hurricanes move, they weaken over land, but the faster they move, the farther inland those strong winds get. So they saw structures coming down, trees down that they haven't seen with other storms. And Wes, that brings up another point. You know, in the last 25 years, most of our hurricanes, we've had our damage after the storm passed from a lot of flooding. But those storms in the past, like Hugo, Hazel, Fran back in '96, show you that we can have a lot of devastation from the wind here in North Carolina too, and we need to be ready for that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that Hazel was a fast mover when over the last few years, Van, I mean, think of the storms that have just sat offshore going 1 mile an hour and 2 mile an hour. But yeah, we've had to deal with a lot of inland flooding, but you know, as Hazel showed us, and as we've learned the last few years, we can get it both ways, inland flooding and really bad wind.
Yeah, and you know, usually if they're moving slow and they give you that flooding, then by the time they do get deeper inland, at least the winds do subside somewhat. But then with the ground so wet, it doesn't take as much wind to bring trees down because the root system's weakened.
Yeah, and you know, we love our trees in North Carolina unless there's a severe thunderstorm or unless there's a hurricane coming. It's a whole different story. Van, good stuff tonight. That's Van Denton in Greensboro, North Carolina. That's the Triad. He's been there for nearly 30 years. So if you're ever in the area, check him out at WGHP. Van, thank you so much. Have a great night.
All right, thank you, Wes.
June is just the first month of the Atlantic hurricane season, and we normally don't have a lot of activity or major storms. But that's not always the case. In June of 2001, Tropical Storm Allison devastated Houston and southeast Texas. And that's where we find KIAH meteorologist Maria Sotolongo. Maria, Allison wasn't a hurricane. It was early in the season, but none of that mattered. Allison did some really bad things to your area. Take us back 19 years and remind us what happened.
That's right. Allison is an example of a storm that never quite reached hurricane status, but it caused severe flooding. It made landfall near Galveston on June 5th, 2001, with winds of about 50 miles per hour. Then, of course, it quickly weakened once inland. It made it north of Houston towards Lufkin, then it looped back around towards Huntsville, eventually once again back over Houston. It made it once again out into the open Gulf of Mexico before going back over Louisiana, crossing the southeast, and eventually out into the east coast. So pretty amazing, surprising storm for us here around Houston. And there went the low. Here are some impressive rainfall totals just for 5 days in some of the bayous here in Harris County and also some of the major airports. Very impressive indeed. Over 38 inches at Greens Bayou, and officially at Bush Airport, where most of the records are kept, over 16 inches. Now, here are some other stats for you about Allison, unfortunately claiming the lives of 23 people, and it cost $5 billion in damage. And get this, it's the only tropical storm to actually have its name retired. We're very aware of hurricanes that have their names retired because of the amazing damage and the trauma and the tragedy that they create, but Tropical Storm Allison is the only one to have actually been retired.
Wow, Maria. Now, Houston is no stranger to flooding. In addition to being right next to the rain-making Gulf of Mexico, why is it so easy to get a flood there, and why does it happen so often? Tell us kind of the makeup of southeast Texas.
Well, actually, Wes, it's a combination of natural and man-made factors. There are a lot of reasons why, but I'll go ahead and make a summary of the three most important reasons why Houston floods so easily. First of all, it was founded on the banks of Buffalo Bayou, and we barely rise above sea level. We also have flat terrain and clay soil, and that makes us really susceptible to flooding. Houston is among the flattest major metropolitan areas in the U.S. We have a slope that is less than about 1 foot per mile, and that means that the draining process is really slow. And one other thing which doesn't really help us much is the tremendous growth that we have here without zoning. So builders actually are not required to use flood mitigation techniques, and sometimes we have way too much concrete, too many subdivisions, too many neighborhoods that are being built, and just simply not enough green spaces.
Wow, amazing and just sad pictures. Now, Allison was almost 20 years ago, but Harvey produced a lot of the same results just 3 years ago. I think a lot of us remember Hurricane Harvey more than Allison. I remember the images of boats driving down streets, houses underwater. How bad was Harvey, Maria, compared to Allison?
Wes, Harvey was Houston's third flood in just 3 years to surpass the 100-year flood mark. Now, according to the National Hurricane Center, Harvey was definitely the most significant tropical cyclone rainfall event in U.S. history, and both in scope and also in peak rainfall amounts since records began in the 1880s. It's definitely one of the worst natural disasters in U.S. history. But Allison, in fact, still holds a record over Harvey, and this is what I'm going to show you in the way of numbers. So in the green, you've got Harvey rainfall totals. In the first hour, Harvey was certainly above Allison. In the third hour rainfall totals, you can see as well that Harvey was beating out Allison with an impressive 14.8 inches. But jump to the 6 and the 12-hour rainfall totals, and that is where Allison still holds the record for most rainfall in 6 hours and in 12 hours, getting 28 plus inches. So again, yes, Harvey was devastating indeed, but in the way of numbers, after 6 hours and 12 hours recorded of rainfall, Allison was certainly pretty disastrous.
Wow, again, amazing numbers. And, you know, people are still recovering from Harvey, Maria, back in 2017. It was bad for a lot of people, and especially for you and your family. You guys lived through some pretty tough times. Can you share with us what you went through during Harvey a few years ago?
Definitely, Wes. It was a huge tragedy personally, and of course for the whole city of Houston and many other areas in Southeast Texas. We live very close to a bayou, in fact, and close to the reservoir that you're seeing now on your screen. And we received, in 14 days, we got 5 feet of rain in our home. So needless to say, that just meant we lost everything. We had a one-story home, and just the amount of water that actually stayed in our home for that long period of time meant we really couldn't save much. So I think that you can also categorize Harvey in 2 different ways. There was the natural rainfall, the natural event of rain that actually fell out of the sky, but we also had the secondary effect of the dams being opened and all of that water staying in our homes for so long. So certainly one that we will never forget for many reasons. And unfortunately, over 75 fatalities in Texas were reported, over 45 inches in Harris County. Now, just to give you an idea, here in Houston, we usually get 50 inches in a year. So we got that in just about a week. There were 120,000 flooded structures, and whereas you had Allison that amassed $5 billion in damages, for Harvey, it was $125 billion in damage.
Maria, I am so sorry to you and your family and to everyone in Southeast Texas. Some tough stuff there. But thank you for sharing your story and spending some time with us tonight. That's Maria Sotolongo at KIH in Houston, Texas. And guess what? That's it for us tonight. Thank you for spending part of your evening with us on Tracking the Tropics. Don't forget, we're here every Tuesday night at 8 Eastern throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm Wes Hohenstein.